talk about one of the more
The divergence test, or endotherm divergence test, states that for the divergence test, or endotherm divergence test, states that for the infinite series,
indirect form of control: economic subservience. The company that owns the majority of our newspapers is 2/3 owned by an American hedge fund. Most of the media we consume is American, and the basis of our economy is ripping natural resources out of the ground, shipping them off to America, and then buying them back for twice the price in the form of fancy toys. We're America's biggest customer, but they're not ours, and that's a precarious position to be in. Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, had just returned to power in the election of 1878. Canada was in the midst of a deep depression that was partially brought on by the Americans canceling a trade agreement in the middle of their Civil War. Macdonald was keenly aware of the public's distrust of American business, and although behind closed doors he was in favor of free trade with the Americans, he knew they would never sign a new agreement. And so he used anti-American rhetoric to call the rival Liberal Party, quote, veiled traitors, and managed to win both the 1878 and 1891 elections by stoking fears of American annexation. Macdonald's platform was called the National Policy, the centerpiece of which was an aggressive import tax on all American products. The tariff was designed to keep cheap American products out of Canada to promote a strong, homegrown manufacturing industry. The national policy and anti-Americanism dominated Canada's political agenda for decades, and a later attempt at a free trade agreement similarly defeated the government of Wilfrid Laurier in 1911, where it was once again painted as an act of treason. However, the national policy, whose stated goal was to keep Canada British, had arguably backfired. It had only made Canada more reliant on American industry. Take, for example, AT&T. Having secured the Canadian patent for the telephone, their original plan was to simply make telephones in America and ship them up to Canada. The new tariffs made that a complete no-go, so the company hatched a plan. They hired a former Confederate ship captain, sent him off to Canada with a boatload of money, where he proceeded to execute a series of business moves so rapid that in just a few months, he owned almost all telephone lines in the entire country. Alongside this purchase was a single telephone factory in Montreal, a necessary condition to retain the Canadian patent. Parts would be shipped up from the US, assembled in Canada, completely negating the import tax. This was the birth of the Bell Telephone Company of Canada, and how Canada became a branch plant economy. And as of 1895, that little Montreal branch plant was given a name: Northern Electric and Manufacturing Limited. We've got about a century to go still, but the family resemblance between these two names is clear. Northern made a bunch of stuff: fire alarms, sleigh bells, gramophones, telegraphs, kettles, toasters, lighters, stoves, washing machines, radios. If it ran on electricity, they could probably make it. But their bread and butter was always telephones. Although legally they were separate entities, AT&T was always in the background pulling the strings of Bell Canada. With its endless monopoly money, Western Electric was cranking out telephone tech like there was no tomorrow. And Northern Electric got access to technology that no one else did without having to do any R&D. They just took the designs that Western gave them, made their tweaks, and sold them to Canadians. Sometimes the only thing that would change was the logo on the phone. Always the branch plant, never the brains. This symbiotic relationship was just a microcosm of the larger Canadian economy. Even in the 1910s, when AT&T is forced to sell off its foreign holdings due to antitrust reasons, it's allowed to keep its stake in Canada because the two countries were so interlinked. Canada had spent its first 50 years relying on its Commonwealth parent of Great Britain, but by the 1920s, Canada was now trading more with the US. As productivity began to rise as America modernized its factories, Canada's were quick to follow. Then, out of nowhere, the markets crashed, ushering in the Great Depression across North America. The 1930s saw 80% of Northern's employees laid off. And then it's World War II, yanking the country and the company out of its depression. Northern becomes a dedicated supplier of military equipment for the government. Canada, like the US, emerges from the war in a relatively prosperous position compared to Europe. Northern now had a backlog of nearly 100,000 telephone orders it had to fulfill. Dragged there by the US, Canada had achieved the second highest adoption rate of phones per 100 people in the entire world, going from just 28,000 phones in 1895 to almost 1 million in 1942. And then suddenly, the elephant rolled over. For years, AT&T had been accused of running a vertical monopoly by owning its manufacturer, Western Electric. Desperate to keep its prized possession, AT&T settles out of court and makes a trade on two conditions. The first is to stay out of the computer business. Considering that Bell Labs had just invented the transistor, they were really going to regret this one in about 10 years. The second is more relevant to our story. AT&T now had to offer the same licensing deal for its patents to anyone who asked. But because AT&T owned Bell Canada and was sharing its patents with them for free, that meant that any other US company would be entitled to that same deal. So rather than give away its patents for free, AT&T said, you know what? Canada is on its own. The CEO of Northern at the time described it like this: "We are the child of wealthy parents. This is the boot that kicked us out the door. A Canadian subsidiary of a US company lives a very comfortable life. This is the tragedy of Canada. We've made a virtue of imitation." But he also said this: "I'm confident history will say this is the best thing that ever happened to us." Would you believe me that in a little more than half a century, the mouse would be trying to eat the elephant?
North, east, south, west, everywhere you go, Northern Electric is the name to know, from coast to coast in Canada.
In the 1950s, the Canadian government contracted the company Avro to build a stealth interceptor jet called the Avro Arrow. It was widely considered to be one of, if not the best in its class in the world. Costing around 2.2 billion Canadian dollars in today's money, the Arrow had been the single most expensive R&D project in Canadian history, and it put Canada on the map in the global aerospace industry. But there was no one to sell it to. The American and the British militaries wanted to produce their own jets. And in fact, America turned around and said, hey, why don't you buy our jets instead? In the most controversial move of his career, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker fell in line with American defense policy. He cancelled the project, ordered all prototypes destroyed, and left 14,000 Canadians unemployed. Although you can argue over the merits of the Avro Arrow itself, the real failure here was that the government refused to support a transition for the facility it had already spent millions on. A facility that could have been converted to civilian aircraft and given Canada its own equivalent to Boeing. It's ironic that Diefenbaker is remembered for capitulating to American influence. Just days before the election that made him Prime Minister, Diefenbaker had declared that if the Liberals were re-elected, quote, Canada will become a virtual 49th economic state in the American Union. You see, anti-Americanism never truly disappears in Canada, but rather it comes in waves. The stretch of time bookended by the two world wars was a notable period of cooperation between the two nations. But now in the era of the Cold War, Canadians were becoming uncomfortable with the idea that they were simply a sidekick to the US. 1956 saw the government release the results of the Gordon Commission, an economic panel which had spent the last year researching the rapid Americanization of Canada. First, there was culture. By the mid-1950s, 80% of magazine sales were from American brands. Canadian newspapers were still Canadian-owned, but any international coverage was usually borrowed from American papers. The Canadian film industry was almost entirely non-existent. Even if we did have films to show, film distribution was owned entirely by Hollywood, and they had no interest in showing Canadian films. Even our education system tended to be biased towards America. There's a particularly infamous textbook on Canadian politics that for some reason had Abraham Lincoln on the cover. The real heart of the issue, though, was economic. In 1967, 58% of Canada's manufacturing industry was owned by firms whose headquarters were outside of Canada, and 80% of that fraction was American. And the more specialized you got, the higher the fraction went. Transport, electronics, chemicals, all extremely American. The worst by far was cars. Can you name a single Canadian car brand? You can't, because there are none left. Natural resources, which had formed the bedrock of Canada's economy for decades, were lining American pocketbooks. Pulp and paper, smelting, mining, and oil and gas, Alberta's pride and joy, was nearly 2/3 owned by Americans. This was such a touchy subject that there was once a debate in Parliament over whether to allow an American company to build an interprovincial oil pipeline. The debate got so heated, 3 MPs were hospitalized and 1 died of a heart attack. Canada was a branch plant economy, and that was scaring people all across the political spectrum. On the left wing, you had labor organizers who feared that the US would simply set up branch plants in Canada, extract natural resources, and then ship them back down south, where Americans would get to reap the benefits from any newly created manufacturing jobs. On the right wing, the complaints tended to focus on how Canada should instead be re-establishing ties with Britain and the monarchy, and that a loss of economic power to the Americans could eventually lead to a loss of political independence. But between these differing sides, there was one common shared concern. American technology was a crutch. Canada had a huge technological deficit. That's one of the key features of a branch plant economy. Branch plants tend to supply jobs that require less training, like resource extraction or assembly lines. Jobs that are easily moved elsewhere if the cost of labor gets too high. Jobs like finance, marketing, and critically R&D are best kept centralized in the home country. In 1959, if you looked at dollars per capita spent on R&D in the private sector, the US was spending almost 4 times as much as Canada. Here's an even more shocking stat. A government commission in the mid-60s looked at every patent registered in Canada. 95% of them were held by someone outside the country, and 2/3 of that number was in the US. That meant the Canadian industry had to spend millions each year licensing out patents from Americans or costly imports of high-tech equipment. Case in point, Northern Electric. In 1956, the year that AT&T had to divest itself, Northern only made 1% of its revenue from its own designs. All the rest were American. For over 60 years, Northern operated mostly on autopilot, assembling American parts using American blueprints. The company atmosphere was described as sleepy and complacent. The CEO at the time joked that you could only get fired for, quote, screwing the boss's daughter, and then only if it was on company premises. Bell Canada was so unsure of Northern that there were multiple times where they considered only 2 options: sell it or shut it down. But there was a third option: break the branch plant cycle, make a Canadian company self-sufficient. And as we've just seen, the political climate at home had never been more supportive. It's not that Northern lacked smart employees, they just hadn't been in charge of the decision-making until now. In fact, Northern's engineers were likely some of the most capable in the entire country. Because of their prior connections to AT&T and Bell Labs, the engineers at Northern Electric were some of the first outside America to be able to reverse engineer and learn about the transistor. By the end of the 1960s, they were the single largest microchip supplier in Canada. They helped build the world's largest microwave comm system, the Trans-Canada Skyway, and they managed to develop an antenna designed to track satellites. But the 60s were still a slow period for Northern. When they began the decade, only 1% of their products were Canadian designs. By 1969, they had only managed to increase that number to 6%. The switchover was going too slowly. The only way to get ahead would be to give Canada its own Bell Labs. BNR. Bell Northern Research. Founded in Ottawa in 1971, it mimicked Bell Labs in every way it could. There was a bounty of $500 for every patent you filed. The atmosphere was like that of a university campus, and there was even a signature color, purple, that the employees rallied behind. Even its first president, Donald Chisholm, had been poached from the real Bell Labs. Look, I'm going to be candid for a second here. BNR is the reason I live in the city that I do. My grandfather was one of the founding engineers hired to work there, and he moved my dad's family from Montreal all the way to Ottawa. BNR is not a name most of you would have heard of, and it sadly doesn't have any Nobel Prizes. But so much of the modern communications landscape, the technology that powers the video you're watching right now, was invented in Ottawa. BNR was about to gamble everything to leapfrog Bell Labs. Telephone switches are the most basic building block of a telephone network. Back in the days of Graham Bell, they were originally just sold in pairs, phone A and phone B, and you put them wherever you needed with a giant wire running between them. Obviously, that's not super scalable, so people decided to designate one building in town as an exchange where human operators would physically move wires around to connect different phone lines. This too was phased out in favor of electromechanical contraptions that were the size of entire rooms. This finally gave way to fully electronic switches, which had fewer moving parts, were much less noisy, and overall more reliable. This was the state of telephone technology as the 60s turned into the 70s. Telephone calls had been analog for as long as they had existed, an electronic wave with smooth curves. But since the advent of the transistor, electronic signals could now be sent in binary. Enough ones and zeros could encode any analog signal with enough precision that barely any information would be lost. That was how computers operated, through massive processors crunching thousands of bits and bytes. People realized fairly quickly that if you could combine phones with computers, the possibilities would be endless. Costs would go down, reliability would go up, you could send multiple phone conversations over the same wire, signal degradation and noise over long distances was far easier to correct. You could also expand into what we now consider basic features like call forwarding or a busy line notification. And maybe, in the far future, You could even use phone lines to send data between two computers. Can you imagine that? Sending something other than voice over telephone lines? That'd be like some kind of inter-network. I don't know, maybe there's a better name for that. The problem with this idea is that digital signals can't talk to analog signals, at least not directly. You need to convert them using a codec. Bell Labs had figured this out in 1963, but the process was so complicated and expensive that it was only worthwhile to do for giant long-distance cables and the connections between huge central offices. There was still no fully digital switch at the local level. There was a full-on race between at least 7 countries to break this digital barrier, and Canada was way in last when it jumped in with BNR. So how did Canada come from behind and win it all? It's because AT&T had become too complacent. Despite having a huge technological head start, AT&T was telling customers that digital switching wouldn't be available for several more years. See, this is the inherent contradiction of monopolies. Their endless resources allow them to develop the best technology and offer the best service. But because they have such a stranglehold on the market, they sometimes stifle innovations that threaten their business model. Case in point, answering machines. Bell Labs invented the technology to record phone calls sometime in the 1940s, but AT&T suffocated it, worried that people would stop using phones for business if they knew they could be recorded. Answering machines wouldn't catch on until the 1970s. It was the same with cell phones. Bell Labs first demonstrated a wireless phone in the 1970s, but again, AT&T refused to develop it. Why would they create a competing type of phone that didn't use the billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that they had taken decades to establish? Cell phones wouldn't catch on until the 1990s. It was the same thing with digital switching. AT&T would be required to update its entire technical ecosystem at a huge cost, not to mention they'd be making their older switches completely redundant. This was an attitude echoed by some executives within Bell Canada. They were certain that a digital switch would kill sales of their just-released SP1 model. But as future CEO John Roth would later say, if you're going to be cannibalized, it's best to be cannibalized by yourself. In 1976, Northern unveiled their newest switch, the SL1, at a trade show they called Digital World, which they hosted at none other than Disney World. The timing was everything. By committing when everyone else was too hesitant, they had caught the rest of the industry by surprise. Because it was the only one of its kind for nearly 2 years, the SL1 became the best-selling switch in the world. After that, the size of the switches just kept increasing. The SL1 became the SL10, then the DMS-10, then the DMS-100. Northern could handle up to 100,000 phone calls through just a single switch. Last time we checked in, Northern made just 6% of their own designs. By 1975, that was 50%, and by 1977, they were up to 70%. This was an unrecognizable company from just 2 decades ago. In fact, this newfound success was worthy of a name change. Northern Electric was far too generic. Everything was electric these days. How about Northern Telecom? It was also a perfect time to go public. In 1973, they go live on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and a couple years later, they made it into the big leagues, Wall Street. During the 70s, Northern had gone from having earnings of $5 million to $111 million, and the workforce grew to 33,000 people. If Northern was an American company, it would have been ranked 160 on the Fortune 500. Northern's CEO during this time was a man named John Lobb, and there's a quote from him that has pretty much become company folklore. He would often go around asking employees what the company made, hoping they'd take the bait. When they inevitably answered with switches, he'd hit them with the real answer. We don't make switching, goddammit, we make money. Look, I'm a sucker for unsubtle metaphors. Northern's first president was a literal former sea captain. For almost 100 years, Northern was shielded from the perils of the open market, only ever sailing close to shore. By going public on the stock market, this was Northern setting out to sea, taking a risk that a Canadian company could go global. And lucky for them, the hammer came crashing down at the perfect time.
Helping you stay on top of change today and tomorrow. That's the power of networking.
Buying a phone? Buy the one that phone companies have relied on for over 100 years. Northern Telecom, a voice you'll recognize from a name you know. Cool it, Rex.
The breakup of AT&T is the picture-perfect definition of hubris. AT&T was the biggest corporation in the world. It employed around 1 million Americans and provided the cheapest and for many decades, the best phone service in the world. For many Americans, they were the only company you could get a telephone from. And it did so through absolutely crushing business tactics. Although the days of literal sabotage were in the past, now it resorted to brutal boardroom takeovers, political lobbying, and fighting tooth and nail to prevent third-party companies from tapping into its network. It had done all of this with the tacit approval of the US government, which granted it the right to exist as a regulated monopoly, one that had an immense role in the US defense industry. The maternalistic image of Ma Bell, however, had been slowly deteriorating for decades. For some people, AT&T was a brute, a bully whose arrogance had gone unchecked for far too long. Service quality had slipped in recent years, and yet phone bills continued to go up. AT&T finally overstepped when it tried to crush a new rival, and later attempted to ram a bill through Congress, a bill that once and for all would crown it the one telephone company to rule them all. This pissed off just the right people in the Justice Department, which initiated an excruciatingly slow and complex legal battle that played out over a decade and 4 different presidents. Although it initially looked like AT&T would walk away with just another slap on the wrist, to the horror of the executives, they gradually realized that their behemoth wasn't nearly as invincible as they thought it was. The breakup agreement in January of 1982 is perhaps the single most impactful and controversial event in the history of American industry. Unlike the 1956 settlement, which saw AT&T make a few small concessions, this new ruling was a devastating defeat, and it left a massive power vacuum. AT&T had been desperate to keep Western Electric under its control, but in exchange, they had to watch the rest of their empire be smashed into 22 pieces. The local phone companies, the Baby Bells as they were called, could now buy their equipment from anyone they wanted. And of those 22 Baby Bells, Northern snatched up 21. Former Vice Chairman David Weiss said this: "When the divestiture took place, we found that our customers embraced us in a bloody bear hug. They'd been with AT&T and Western Electric all those years and had been taken for granted. In just a couple years, Northern rockets up to become the #2 telecom company in North America, right behind Western Electric. Its much bigger, but now extremely depressed cousin. Previously, Northern had negotiated an unspoken deal with AT&T that they would stay out of their turf. They would only sell to the independents who despised AT&T. But now, the big bad mob boss had been whacked." The impact of this ruling is obvious on Northern's stock price. You can see in '82 when it becomes clear that AT&T is going to have to give in, that Northern begins to slowly tick up. By the time the breakup becomes official in '84, Northern's stock price is 3 times what it was. It had broken the curse of the branch plant. As of '82, Northern was officially making more money in the US market than in Canada. This was always bound to happen. The market in America is 10 times as big. The real question was how much of it they could capture. The expansion was rapid. Northern began setting up plants in California, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina. Soon there were 13,000 Americans working for Northern. When it came to grand marketing gestures, nothing was too expensive. Northern chartered a cruise ship, the SS Rotterdam, filled with members of the Fortune 500 community, and wined and dined them for days. When an elaborate trade show in Europe was almost shut down due to concerns over poor ventilation, Northern paid to have an expensive hole cut in the roof. With the financial backing of Bell Canada behind them, Northern was unstoppable. Which raises an interesting point. Why did AT&T get broken up, but Bell Canada was allowed to live on? Bell Canada, although it tried very hard, never quite maintained a true monopoly like AT&T had managed to down south. Although at the peak of its power in the early 1900s, it had steadily lost ground ever since. In terms of sheer land mass, the US and Canada aren't that far off, but the vast majority of Canada is extremely remote. Maintaining a presence in the less populated regions proved so costly that service was often unreliable, angering the locals. In the Maritimes, Bell itself had been pushed out by some local rivals. In the prairies, the residents were so fed up with the poor service that the provincial governments bought Bell out and turned them into provincial utilities. Easily the second coolest things the prairies have done for us after giving us universal healthcare. And BC was so far away that Bell never even bothered to try and get a foothold on the west coast. If Bell Canada had a monopoly, it was restricted to the Windsor-Quebec City corridor, the home of over half the population. Bell Canada had achieved the ideal size, the Goldilocks zone, big enough to dominate the market, but small enough that the politicians left it alone. The few attempts at cracking down on Bell's monopoly fizzled out as Canada's regulatory agencies were undermined and overruled by the government. And if I had to hazard a guess, I think Pierre Trudeau and his cabinet were happy to sit back and watch the American telephone company implode so Canada could pick up the scraps. The Canadian-American divide of the 50s continued to surge into the 60s and 70s. JFK hated Diefenbaker for his flip-flopping over the Cuban Missile Crisis. LBJ hated Pearson's guts for not backing them in Vietnam. And then you had Nixon and Trudeau, two men who could not have been more different in both personality and politics. Whether it was because of Trudeau's open diplomacy with China and Cuba, or Nixon abruptly announcing a 10% tariff with no warning, the Canadian-US relationship truly hit a low point in the 70s. It was in this climate that Trudeau's minority government, with a push from the left-wing NDP, created FIRA. The Foreign Investment Review Agency was, on paper at least, a way to block foreign takeovers and screen foreign investment that didn't bring, quote, a significant benefit to Canadians. FIRA was never very popular. The right wing called it overreaching, the left wing called it toothless, and the left wing of the left wing were over in the corner chanting the words nationalization over and over. Trudeau himself had not been much of an economic nationalist. He'd been pushed into creating FIRA by a minority parliament, and by the 80s the Liberals were desperately trying to woo back the private sector. Pierre Trudeau had served one of the longest tenures of a PM in the country's history, and his later years had been dominated by issues of national unity and an economic downturn. The East-West divide that had always existed continued to widen. Trudeau's nationalization of the oil industry had made him a pariah in the oil-rich West. Trudeau, a longtime opponent of Quebec's growing separatist movement, had become increasingly unpopular in the province after he pushed through a new constitution without their approval. And the practice known as the 60s scoop had continued well into the 1980s, where Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their parents and placed up for adoption with white families. Others were placed in residential schools, where any and all semblance of Indigenous language, culture, and heritage were forcibly stamped out. This was not a united country. For a multitude of reasons, there were and still are millions of people living within Canada's borders who do not identify as Canadian, who do not identify with this flag. If there had been a strong nationalist movement in the 70s, it had fractured into pieces by the 80s. Bell and Northern were among the leading voices in Canadian capital that were demanding a changing of the guard. High tech, they said, was the industry that would yank Canada out of its recession. They wanted the government that would lower their taxes and reduce trade barriers for expanding into the newly vulnerable US market. They would get their wish in Brian Mulroney. Mulroney and his Tories delivered one of the most lopsided electoral wins in Canadian history. He was cut from the same ideological cloth as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher: deregulation, privatization, and the free market. 23 of Canada's 61 crown corporations were privatized under Mulroney. FIRA, which was already a rubber stamp machine at this point, was dismantled even further and renamed Investment Canada. Its oversight over new investment was completely eliminated, and its ability to block foreign takeovers was scaled back so much, the act has only been invoked a handful of times since. Mulroney declared that Canada was open for business. He didn't see American money as a threat. He openly welcomed it. As public polling around free trade began to shift, he believed that by adopting it as his party's key policy plank, it would carry them through the next election. Critically though, he would never have considered it if not for his extremely close relationship with Ronald Reagan. Reagan's advisors feared phone calls from Canada because, quote, he could get the president to do anything he wanted. Mulroney was the only foreigner to speak at Reagan's funeral. Without this close relationship, free trade between the two countries may never have been adopted. We've only seen small glimpses of it, but the US has a long history of its own economic protectionism. Several times in the past century and a half, American tariffs have sent the Canadian economy spiraling. When it pulled out of a trade deal in 1850, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs during the Great Depression, the Nixon shock of the 70s, and most recently, Ronald Reagan had been promoting a Made in America policy that threatened to block companies like Northern from America altogether. Canadians weren't necessarily afraid of free trade. What they were afraid of was getting the short end of the stick in negotiations with a country that many perceived as a bully. This was the message of Liberal leader John Turner. He considered himself a proponent of free trade, but not a bilateral agreement directly with the US. It's one thing to negotiate in the context of dozens of countries coming together. It's another to try and negotiate one-on-one with a country 10 times your size. Thanks to TV ads like this one, free